Imagine facing an army 22 times your size, not in a video game but in real life. No backup, no retreat, just you, a few dozen soldiers, and thousands of enemy troops closing in. Sounds impossible, right? But this actually happened. In 1814, during the War of 1812, a small British force of just 180 soldiers at Lacolle Mills took on a 4,000-strong American invasion force and won. How? Was it sheer luck, tactical brilliance, or something else entirely? And why is this battle barely mentioned in history? This is the greatest underdog victory in Britain's history, and today, we're going to uncover how a handful of men managed to defy the odds and rewrite history. It was March 30th, 1814. The War of 1812 was raging between the British Empire and the United States. The Americans had already attempted multiple invasions of Canada, but the British had successfully repelled most of them. Now, a new attack was coming. A force of 4,000 American troops, led by Major General James Wilkinson, was marching toward Lacolle Mills, a British outpost in Quebec. The Americans had one goal: crush the British forces stationed there and open the route to Montreal. The problem? The British were completely outnumbered. Only 180 British regulars from the 13th Regiment of Foot were stationed at Lacolle Mills. A handful of Canadian militia and indigenous warriors were present, but the numbers were still dire. The Americans had artillery, superior firepower, and an overwhelming advantage. By every calculation, this should have been a massacre. But the British had one thing the Americans didn't: tactical genius. Two key factors that turned the tide of battle. The battlefield was their secret weapon. The British knew they couldn't win in open combat, so they forced the Americans to fight on their terms. The outpost at Lacolle Mills was surrounded by dense forest, making it hard for the Americans to maneuver their massive army. The British positioned themselves inside a well-defended stone mill which absorbed cannon fire and gave them a fortified position. Instead of standing in formation, the British used cover, barricades, and sharpshooting tactics to make every shot count. This completely neutralized the Americans' numerical advantage. Psychological warfare, the power of fear. The Americans expected the British to panic and surrender. Instead, they got relentless resistance. The British didn't back down, making the Americans believe they had more troops hidden in the forest. Every time the Americans tried to advance, they were met with deadly accurate fire, slowing them down and killing morale. The battle dragged on for hours, and the Americans started losing confidence. Wilkinson had expected a quick victory. Instead, his troops were trapped in a battle they weren't prepared for. After hours of fighting, Wilkinson realized something terrifying. His 4,000 troops couldn't break a defense held by just 180 British soldiers. He ordered a full-scale artillery bombardment, thinking the British fortifications would finally collapse. They didn't. The British held the line. The Americans had wasted thousands of rounds of ammunition, but the British still weren't retreating. Wilkinson had two choices: keep fighting and risk massive casualties, or retreat and admit defeat. With panic spreading among his ranks, he made his decision. The Americans retreated. The battle was over. The British had won. The moment the British decided to fight back. Imagine standing inside a small stone mill, the walls shaking as American artillery shells slam into the structure. Smoke fills the air, gunfire echoes through the trees, and outside, an army of 4,000 enemy soldiers is waiting for you to slip up. But you don't, because you're part of one of the most disciplined fighting forces in the world. And you know that victory isn't about numbers, it's about strategy. On the morning of March 30th, 1814, Major Richard Hancock, the commanding British officer at Lacolle Mills, gathered his men and laid out the plan. We do not fight them on their terms, we make them fight on ours. His strategy? Use the battlefield, disrupt enemy movements, and outlast the Americans. The battle plan that should have failed, but didn't. Fortify the mill, turn a weakness into an advantage. Most military experts would agree defending a stone mill against thousands of enemy troops sounds like a suicide mission. But Hancock saw something different. The mill had thick stone walls, making it resistant to musket fire and artillery bombardment. It was surrounded by dense trees, limiting the Americans' ability to move in formation or fire in volleys. The British positioned sharpshooters inside the mill, allowing them to pick off American officers and artillery crews. Instead of being a death trap, the mill became an impenetrable fortress. Hit-and-run tactics make every shot count. With only 180 soldiers, every bullet needed to matter. The British couldn't afford to waste ammunition. They used hit-and-run tactics, firing from protected positions before quickly retreating behind cover. They aimed for officers first, disrupting American leadership and causing confusion in the ranks. Every time the Americans tried to advance, they were met with precision fire that forced them to stop and regroup. Psychological warfare at its finest. Trick the enemy into thinking they were stronger. One of the biggest psychological tricks in military history is making the enemy think you have more troops than you actually do. The British fired from multiple positions, making it seem like their numbers were greater. They used bugle calls and drum signals, creating the illusion that reinforcements were arriving. Whenever the Americans tried to storm the mill, the British responded with a level of resistance that made it seem like they were prepared for a long siege. The Americans started losing confidence. The turning point, the Americans lose their nerve. After 4 hours of intense fighting, General Wilkinson realized his 4,000-strong army was making no progress. His artillery bombardment had failed. His troops were exhausted and demoralized, and worst of all, he had no idea how many British troops he was actually facing. So, he made the worst decision possible. He hesitated. The British counterattack, a final blow to the invasion. Sensing that the Americans were wavering, Hancock ordered a counterattack. British troops and Canadian militia stormed out of the mill, firing into the exposed enemy lines. Indigenous warriors launched a surprise flank attack, cutting off key American positions. The Americans, already low on morale, broke rank and began retreating in chaos. In just a matter of minutes, what was once a confident invasion force of 4,000 had turned into a disorganized retreat. By nightfall, Wilkinson and his remaining troops were forced to abandon the attack completely. The British had won. The aftermath, a victory that changed everything. The Americans had lost hundreds of men in the failed assault. The British lost only a handful of soldiers. This battle ended any serious U.S. attempt to invade Lower Canada. It was a victory that shouldn't have happened. And yet, against impossible odds, a force of just 180 men had held off an entire army. The battle was won, but why didn't it become legendary? Picture this. A tiny force of 180 men holds off 4,000 invaders, repelling an army that outnumbered them 22-1. The British should have celebrated it as one of their greatest military victories. But ask most people about the Battle of Lacolle Mills, and they've never even heard of it. Why? Why isn't this battle talked about in the same way as Thermopylae, Agincourt, or Rorke's Drift? History has a habit of forgetting victories that don't fit the narrative. Let's break down why this incredible David versus Goliath battle was largely erased from popular history. The War of 1812 was complicated. Unlike battles that end with clear, decisive winners, the War of 1812 was a messy conflict with no obvious champion. The Americans wanted to invade Canada and push the British out of North America. The British were focused on fighting Napoleon in Europe and saw the war as a distraction. Both sides won some battles and lost others, leading to an inconclusive peace treaty. That means even big victories like Lacolle Mills didn't get the recognition they deserved because there was no glorious final outcome. From the perspective of British commanders, Lacolle Mills was a defensive battle, not a game-changing campaign. The British already controlled Canada. Winning at Lacolle didn't gain them new territory. It was seen as a minor success rather than a historic triumph. The British military at the time was more focused on the Napoleonic Wars, where they were fighting much larger battles across Europe. To the average British general, this was just another skirmish in a much bigger picture. No one likes talking about embarrassing defeats. The US had overwhelming numbers and still failed to take a tiny British outpost. It was a humiliating failure for Major General Wilkinson, who was later removed from command. American history books preferred to highlight victories like the Battle of New Orleans, rather than defeats like Lacolle Mills. If you can't spin a loss into a noble struggle, sometimes it's easier to just pretend it never happened. The War of 1812 ended in 1815, the same year as the Battle of Waterloo, where the British defeated Napoleon. Compared to Britain's war in Europe, a battle in Canada with 4,000 troops wasn't considered a big deal. The British public and historians focused on European victories, leaving events like Lacolle to fade into the background. This is why, even though it was one of Britain's greatest underdog victories, it never became legendary in the way that other battles did. A force of just 180 men stood against an army of 4,000. They turned a simple stone mill into an impenetrable fortress. They used psychological warfare, superior tactics, and sheer determination to win. This wasn't just a lucky battle, it was a masterclass in military strategy, an example of how the few can defeat the many, and a story that deserves to be remembered. And now, you know the truth. This wasn't just any battle, this was Britain's greatest underdog victory. The battle that time forgot but shouldn't have. 180 men versus 4,000. A battle so lopsided that no general in their right mind would expect victory. And yet the British didn't just survive, they won. But history tried to erase this story. Now, over 200 years later, the question remains, what can we learn from this battle today? How did it influence future military tactics? And why does the legacy of Lacolle Mills still matter? Let's break it down. The Battle of Lacolle Mills wasn't just an underdog victory. It was a textbook example of tactical brilliance. The British knew they couldn't win a field battle. Instead, they forced the Americans into close-quarters combat where numbers meant nothing. The forest and mill created a choke point, limiting enemy movement. By holding a fortified position, the British neutralized American firepower. Cover, elevation, and precision shooting made every shot count. The Americans, unable to use their advantage, became sitting ducks. Psychological warfare making 180 men feel like 1,000. Fake reinforcements using bugle calls and shifting positions, targeting officers first, disrupting command and causing panic. Relentless resistance, making the enemy question if they could win. These strategies weren't just luck, they were battle-tested tactics that influenced later conflicts. Believe it or not, this small battle had ripple effects on military strategy. Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. The British used fortifications and defensive positioning to hold off numerically superior Russian forces. Battle of Rorke's Drift, 1879, a small British force of 150 men successfully defended a mission station against 4,000 Zulu warriors using similar tactics. World War I trench warfare, 1914 to 1918. Defensive positions became the standard strategy in modern warfare. While not widely credited, the lessons of Lacolle Mills were seen in every war that followed. History loves to celebrate massive battles, famous generals, and decisive wars, but sometimes the greatest stories are the ones that almost got lost. It proved that courage, strategy, and terrain can defeat overwhelming odds. It showed that war isn't just about numbers, it's about intelligence. And it's a reminder that sometimes history's greatest victories happen in the shadows. So why was this battle forgotten? Because it wasn't part of a grand narrative. There was no massive territorial gain, no parade for the victors, no legendary speeches. But make no mistake, it was a victory that mattered. Beyond military tactics, beyond history books, this battle teaches something deeper. Never underestimate the power of a determined few. Superior numbers mean nothing without strategy. True strength comes from resilience, not size. This isn't just a story about war. It's a story about defying the impossible. And now, over 200 years later, this victory, Britain's greatest underdog battle, is no longer forgotten. It's remembered. And so are the soldiers who fought it. You started this video thinking, 180 men against 4,000? No way, now you know it happened. And they won. This was more than just a battle. It was a lesson in survival, strategy, and the power of the human spirit. What do you think? Should this battle be taught in history books? Drop a comment below. Like and subscribe for more forgotten history and legendary battles. Fade out.